The morning I finished the last wall, I stood on the platform I'd bolted to the cliff face and looked down at the water 60 feet below. And I sat into my son. And I remember thinking, nobody would come here unless they had a reason. That was the whole point. My name is Daniel Reeves. I need you to understand that before anything else. Because everything that follows only makes sense if you know who I was before it started. I was 34 years old. I had $17 in a checking account, and I owned a parcel of land on the Oregon coast that I'd inherited from my Uncle Frank, who had bought it in 1987 because it was unbuildable and therefore cheap. The county had classified it as unusable. The cliff dropped 60 feet into a tidal channel that cut between the headland and a basalt shelf the locals called the Tooth. At high tide, the channel filled completely. At low tide, it was maybe 8 feet of exposed rock and kelp. You couldn't reach the cliff base on foot without timing it to the minute. And even then, the approach was a scramble over wet stone that would turn an ankle in good weather. Frank had never done anything with it. I had spent 3 years doing something with it. The cabin was small, 16 feet by 20, cantilevered on a steel frame I'd welded myself and anchored into the basalt with epoxy bolts rated for marine exposure. The floor joists ran perpendicular to the cliff face. From the water, if anyone bothered to look, it appeared to be a natural outcropping. I'd clad the exterior in reclaimed cedar that had weathered to the same gray-brown as the stone. There were no windows facing the water. The single window on the landward side was covered with a panel that latched from inside. I had designed it to be invisible, and I had succeeded. Power came from 4 solar panels mounted flat against the roof slope, angled specifically to avoid visible reflection from the coastal road above. Water came from a 600-gallon cistern fed by a roof-to-gutter system I'd pressure-tested twice. Food was stacked in a storage loft above the sleeping area. Enough calories for 14 months if I ate conservatively, which I always did. I had a single-burner propane setup with 4 tanks, a hand-crank radio, a medical kit I'd spent 8 months assembling, and a library of 41 paperback novels I'd bought from thrift stores for a total of $31. I also had a neighbor. Her name was Cora Tillman. She was 57 years old, and she lived 300 yards up the coast road in a house she'd bought in Gwen with her late husband 20 years before he died. She was the only person who knew the cabin existed, because she had watched me build it from her kitchen window. And one afternoon, she had walked down the service path to the cliff edge and called out to me while I was working on the frame. And instead of pretending I didn't hear her, I made the mistake of looking up. Cora was not the kind of person you could pretend not to hear. She had a voice that carried the way a foghorn carries. Not loud exactly, but designed to travel through conditions that would absorb everything else. She brought me coffee that first afternoon in a thermos she never asked back for. We talked for 40 minutes on the cliff top, me with a wrench still in my hand. She asked why I was building it. I told her it was because I wanted a place no one could reach easily. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "That sounds lonely." I told her that was the idea. That was 14 months before the outbreak. I remember the exact morning the radio changed. I had been hearing fragments for 3 days, interrupted broadcasts, civil emergency tones without follow-up messages, a CDC advisory that cut off mid-sentence and never resumed. But the morning I knew it was real was a Tuesday in late October, when I heard a woman's voice on a local Coos Bay frequency saying, simply and without inflection, "They're in the hospital. Don't go to the hospital. They're in the hospital." Repeating it, not panicking, just reporting. The way you'd report weather. I looked out my landward panel at the cliff top above me. The coastal road was empty. The sky was the color of old tin. Below me, the tidal channel was at mid-rise, dark green and cold, and the Tooth stood in the water like it always had, and nothing had changed yet. But I'd heard that voice, and she wasn't going to stop repeating it. By the 3rd day, I had a system. I want to be precise about this, because the system is what kept me alive when everything else stopped working, and I've spent a long time since then thinking about whether precision was a virtue or just a way of avoiding the fact that I was afraid. The answer is both. But at the time, I called it operational clarity, and it felt like the same thing as courage. The system was this. I divided the day into 4 observation blocks: dawn, midday, late afternoon, and dusk. During each block, I spent 20 minutes on the landward observation platform, a 2-foot-wide shelf I'd added to the cliff-top access ladder, screened by a weathered plywood panel with a 1-inch horizontal slit cut at eye level. From that slit, I had a clean line of sight to 200 yards of coastal road in each direction and a partial view of Cora's house through the cypress trees she'd planted along her property line. On day 3, I watched a pickup truck come down the coast road at a speed that told me everything. It wasn't speeding. It was moving at maybe 15 miles per hour, which is the speed of someone who has realized that speed attracts attention and has made the conscious decision to slow down. There were 2 people in the cab. The truck had a cracked windshield that morning, and I made a decision I spent 4 days regretting. I climbed the full access ladder to the cliff top, crossed the 30 yards of coastal scrub to her back gate, and knocked. She opened the door in under 10 seconds, which meant she'd been watching for me. The kitchen was organized with the specific kind of intention that told me she hadn't panicked. There was a map of the county on the table, and she'd drawn concentric circles in pencil centered on the town of Bandon, 12 miles south. The innermost circle was labeled confirmed in her handwriting. The outer circles weren't labeled at all. "I've been listening to the scanner," she said before I could speak. She meant a police scanner she kept on her kitchen shelf, a habit left over from the years when her husband had volunteered with the county fire service. Bandon is gone. Not damaged. Gone. The last transmission was 31 hours ago, and it was a deputy calling for backup that never came. I sat down at her table. I did not want to sit down, but my legs had processed information before my brain had finished arguing with it. She poured coffee. Old habit, executed with complete steadiness. I noted this the way I noted everything, filed it, weighted it, tried to understand what it meant about what came next. "How much food do you have?" I asked. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if I cut portions. I have a root cellar the previous owners dug in the 50s. It's full of things I canned last summer. She paused. I also have a problem. The problem was sitting in the living room. His name was Marcus, and he was 22 years old, and he was Cora's nephew, and he had arrived 2 nights ago on foot from Coos Bay, which meant he had walked 14 miles in the dark along a coast road that was no longer safe, and he had a gash along his left forearm from a fall on the highway median that he had bandaged himself with a torn shirt. He was not infected. I checked. I don't mean I asked him. I watched him for the full 20 minutes I was in that house. Watched his eyes, his hands, the way he tracked sound when something moved outside. Infection, I had already learned from the radio broadcasts, progressed through a specific behavioral cascade before the physical symptoms became obvious. Marcus was frightened and exhausted and in pain, which is the opposite behavioral signature. And there's a difference you can read if you're paying attention. He told me what Coos Bay looked like. I won't repeat most of it. What matters is the specific detail that changed my calculation. The harbor. He said the harbor had been the last place people had tried to concentrate because water still felt like safety to everyone, and it had become the worst place in the city because of it. People had congregated exactly where the geography made escape impossible, and the infected had followed the density. I thought about that for a long time in silence. Then I looked at Cora and said, "I need to show you both something." Getting Cora down the access ladder the first time required a conversation I hadn't anticipated. She stood at the cliff edge, looked at the ladder descending the basalt face, 42 rungs, steel, marine-coated, bolted every 6 feet, and she turned to me with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but was its functional equivalent. A precise, rational assessment of personal limitation delivered without embarrassment. "My right knee," she said. "Replacement, 2019. Descending ladders is not something I do gracefully." Marcus went first to demonstrate. He was down in 90 seconds. moving with the automatic confidence of someone young enough that physical risk still feels like a problem belonging to other people. He reached the platform outside the cabin door and looked up and gave a thumbs up that I found, in the circumstances, almost unbearably normal. I went down behind Cora, one rung at a time, one hand near her hip without touching it. And she descended with a focused, methodical deliberateness that I found myself respecting in a way that surprised me. She didn't hurry. She didn't ask for help she didn't need. She simply did the thing at the speed the thing required and didn't apologize for the speed. When she reached the platform and stepped through the cabin door and saw the interior, she was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of disappointment, the quiet of someone recalculating. "You built this by yourself," she said. "Over 3 years, yes. And you were planning to stay here alone." "That was the plan." She looked at the storage loft, the cistern gauge, the hand crank radio on the shelf, the 41 paperbacks stacked in a cedar crate under the sleeping platform. Then she looked at me with an expression I could not fully interpret, which was unusual because I was generally good at reading people who weren't trying to hide what they were feeling. "Daniel," she said, "how long have you been practicing being alone?" I didn't answer that. Marcus was examining the structural bolts where the floor joists met the cliff face, running his fingers along the epoxy fills, and I was grateful for the interruption. What Marcus brought, beyond the information about Coos Bay, was something I hadn't budgeted for: practical utility in a domain I'd underestimated. He had worked 2 summers on fishing boats out of Charleston, which is the small harbor south of Coos Bay, and he understood marine systems, rope work, load management, and, critically, tides. He could read the tidal channel below us with a fluency I had never developed despite 3 years of living above it. On the second morning, he watched the channel for 10 minutes and told me there was a secondary eddy pattern on the south side of the tooth that I hadn't mapped, and that at a specific tidal window, there was a climbable approach to the basalt shelf that I dismissed as inaccessible. "Show me," I said. "Not yet," he said, and looked at the road above us. And I understood that he was thinking about what else might use that approach before we mapped it. That was the first time I understood that Marcus was not a liability I had absorbed out of social obligation. He was a person who had been paying attention to different things than I had, for different reasons. And the overlap between what he'd noticed and what I'd missed was significant. The cabin held 3 people. This is not a comfortable fact. The sleeping platform was designed for 1, and I built a second platform for Cora from spare decking lumber, and 2 sawhorses I had stored under the cabin floor. And Marcus took the floor with a sleeping pad and a bag he'd carried from Coos Bay without any apparent resentment about the arrangement. We developed, within 48 hours, a nighttime protocol that felt oddly formal and was absolutely necessary. 1 person awake per 4-hour block, positioned at the landward observation slit, with a specific list of things to watch for and a specific action for each scenario. Nothing happened for 6 nights. On the 7th night, Marcus woke me at 2 a.m. by putting his hand on my shoulder, no words, which was our signal for something is moving. I was at the slit in 4 seconds. On the road, moving south, was a group. 8 people. No flashlights, moving in the kind of loose, uneven cluster that forms when people are trying to stay quiet but have not agreed on a pace. They passed in 3 minutes. One of them, I could not tell if it was a man or a woman, stopped briefly on the road shoulder directly above the clifftop access point, and I stopped breathing in, the way that is not actually useful, but happens anyway, and then the figure moved on and rejoined the group, and they were gone into the dark. I stayed at the slit for another hour after that. Cora relieved me at 3, and I lay on the sleeping platform and did not sleep, running through every scenario in which 8 people moving south on a dark coastal road might loop back north for reasons I couldn't predict. The group came back on day 9. Not all 8. 4 of them, moving north this time in daylight. And one of them was carrying something I recognized from 300 yards, a yellow dry bag, the kind used for kayaking. I'd had one exactly like it, still had it, stored under my sleeping platform. It was not an object that signaled danger. It signaled that someone in that group had, at some point, planned to be near water. I watched them pass. Marcus watched beside me, and when they were gone, he said, quietly, "The one in front." She was looking at the cliff edge, not the road. He meant she was looking for what the cliff might offer, not trying to remember where she'd parked. That was a specific kind of attention. I filed it. Cora was heating water on the propane burner when we came back in, and she handed me a cup of something that was technically tea, in the same way that the cabin was technically a house. It met the minimum criteria and made no apologies for it. She had been listening to the hand-crank radio while we were on observation. She had a notebook now, a spiral-bound one from a drawer in the cabin I had never opened, and she was writing in it. "What are you tracking?" I asked. "Broadcast patterns," she said. "Which frequencies go silent and when?" "Silence has a geography if you listen to enough of it." I stared at her for a moment. "I was a high school math teacher for 28 years, she said, which was either an explanation or a rebuttal, and I wasn't sure which. The radio picture was this. Portland had gone dark on day 2 of what the emergency broadcasts were still calling a public health event, which was the most inadequate phrase I had ever encountered in my life. Salem went dark on day 4. The southern Oregon coast was receiving fragments of a FEMA-coordinated channel that appeared to be broadcasting from somewhere in Northern California. The signal quality suggested distance, and the content of those fragments was the kind of institutional language that tells you the institution generating it has lost contact with the situation it's describing. There was a phrase repeated across multiple broadcasts that Cora had underlined twice in her notebook. "Shelter in place until further notice." "Further notice from whom?" Marcus had said. Not angrily, just as a genuine question. Nobody answered it. What I was managing in those early days was not just logistics. I want to be clear about that, because the logistics were the easier part. I had planned for the logistics. What I hadn't planned for was the specific psychological weight of knowing that the world outside was catastrophically wrong, and being unable to do anything about the knowing except continue to observe and record and wait. I had built the cabin to be a closed system. I had stocked it for one person's self-sufficiency. I had designed my isolation as a solution to a set of problems I'd accumulated over 34 years of finding other people's unpredictability exhausting and their needs impossible to satisfy. And now there were 3 of us. And one of us was a 57-year-old woman with a replaced knee and a notebook full of signal analysis. And one of us was a 22-year-old boat worker who could read tides better than I could. And I had $17 in a checking account that was now completely irrelevant. And what I had instead was a cabin on a cliff that nobody could reach without significant effort. And the specific kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly how thin the margin is between the place you are and the place everything has fallen apart. On day 10, one of the 4 returned alone. She stood on the cliff top above the access ladder for a full 4 minutes, not calling out, not moving, just standing with that yellow dry bag over one shoulder and looking down at the cliff face. She was maybe 30, dark-haired, wearing a rain jacket that had seen significant recent use. Marcus said, "She knows the ladder is there." "How?" I said. "Because she's standing 2 feet from it," he said, "and she's not looking at it." Which meant she was working very hard not to look at it. Which meant she had already seen it and was deciding whether to pretend she hadn't. I made a decision in about 4 seconds that I've thought about every day since. I unlatched the landward panel and opened it and looked at her through the gap. And she turned immediately. She had been watching the panel, not the ladder. And we looked at each other across 30 yards of coastal scrub and gray October air. And I said nothing. And she said nothing. And then I said, "How many of you are there?" Her name was Sarah Walsh. She was 31, a wilderness EMT from Medford, who had been in the middle of a week-long solo coastal kayak trip when the outbreak reached the towns she'd been planning to resupply in. She had paddled past Bandon 2 days after Marcus had walked out of Coos Bay, and she had seen enough from the water to understand what Marcus had described from the street. The difference in her account was the vantage point. From the water, she said, the infected didn't appear random. They had a kind of directional coherence, not coordinated in any way that suggested communication, but trending, always toward density, always toward noise and light, and the specific signatures of concentrated human presence. They're following the same instinct we are, she said. Find other people. It just looks different when you can't think about why. She said this while sitting on the observation platform outside the cabin door, with her feet hanging over the 60-foot drop to the tidal channel, eating a portion of rice I'd allocated with the specific precision of someone who has already done the math on 14 months' worth of calories, for one now being divided by a growing denominator. She didn't seem to mind the drop. She had been living on open water for a week. The other 3 in her group were 2 brothers, Eli and Tom Cassius, 28 and 31, who had been clearing brush on a coastal property they'd been hired to manage when the cellular networks dropped on day 1, and they'd had no information for 4 days until Sarah found them on a headland 2 miles north. The 4th was a woman named June Park, 63 years old, a retired county extension agent who had been checking on a community garden project in the hills east of the coast road, and had walked down to the highway when she heard a car alarm going for 6 hours without stopping, and found Eli and Tom instead. June had a bad hip. Not replaced, just worn. The kind of chronic degradation that changes your pace without stopping your movement. She took the ladder the way Cora had, methodically, without complaint, and with a stubbornness that I recognized as the specific variety that develops in people who have spent decades being underestimated on account of physical limitation. 7 people. The cabin designed for one now held 7 people. I did the math on the food supply that same evening, at the table, out loud, with everyone present, because I had decided, and this decision cost me something I am still identifying, that the people sharing the cliff with me were owed the same information I was working from. The math said, 14 months for 1 becomes 11 weeks for 7. Assuming current stores and no supplementation, 11 weeks was not enough. Tom Cassius, who had said almost nothing since descending the ladder, said, "What's on the tooth?" The tooth was the basalt shelf in the channel, 60 feet by 40 at low tide, covered at high tide, slick with kelp and bearing several permanent tide pools that I had cataloged out of habit but never thought of as a resource. I told him what I knew. He nodded slowly. "Mussels," he said. "Limpets. Probably sea urchin in the deeper pools. Seaweed you can eat. It's not comfortable calories, but it's calories." He was right. I had been sitting above a food source for 3 years and had not once thought of it as food because I'd had enough food not to need to think that way. This is the kind of category error that only becomes visible when your category changes, and mine had changed with the arrival of 6 people I hadn't invited, but couldn't send back into a world I'd already watched kill Coos Bay and Bandon and Portland and Salem. Eli set up a watch rotation that included everyone, including June, who couldn't take the ladder but could watch the coastal road from the cliff top, using a position she'd scouted herself without asking permission. Sarah inventoried her medical kit against mine and produced a combined resource list with a prioritized consumption order. Marcus drew a tide chart from memory that was accurate to within 4 minutes, which I verified against the almanac I kept above my sleeping platform. Cora updated her frequency log, and, on the second evening, with the full group present, summarized the signal geography in terms so clear that nobody interrupted her. She concluded with, "There is one broadcast, military band, that has been consistent for 6 days. It's not saying much, but it's saying the same thing reliably, which is more than anything else on this dial." She let that sit. Then June said, "From the corner where she'd been so quiet, I'd half forgotten she was there. Consistent isn't the same as trustworthy. But it's a start. The first time we lost someone to the channel, It wasn't to the infected, and it wasn't fatal. And the fact that it wasn't fatal is the reason I can talk about it without the kind of weight that presses down on everything else in this story. Marcus went down to the tooth on a low-tide window to test the harvest potential Tom had identified, and he slipped on the kelp crossing the basalt shelf, and the eddy he'd identified, but hadn't yet fully mapped, pulled him 8 feet south before he got his footing on the channel bottom, which was chest-deep at that tidal moment. He came up sputtering and cold, and with a gash on his right palm from the barnacled rock he'd grabbed to stop himself, and he climbed back to the platform, with muscles in the dry bag he'd taken down, and a grin that I found simultaneously infuriating. And I'll admit, briefly clarifying about something I hadn't expected to feel. Sarah cleaned and dressed the palm cut with a competence that made it look like she'd done it 100 times, which she had. She told him to keep it dry for 48 hours, which was advice he followed for approximately 12, because on the following low tide, he went back down with Tom, and they came up with enough mussels and limpets to supplement 2 days of rations, and Marcus's hand didn't get infected. And I recalculated the food timeline with the new daily supplement factored in, and arrived at a number that was still uncomfortable, but was no longer catastrophic. The cabin was working. That's what I kept coming back to in the early weeks. The design was working, not just as a shelter, but as a social system, which was something I had specifically not designed it to be. 7 people. 1 latrine system I'd built for 1 fresh water supply that required careful management, 1 propane setup that now ran 1 meal per day to conserve fuel, 41 paperback novels that were rotating through hands at a pace I hadn't predicted, and a single observation slit that required a schedule and was on that schedule every hour of every day. What I hadn't built for was quiet, not silence. The cliff was never silent. The channel moved and the wind came off the Pacific with a constancy that became its own kind of noise. The quiet between people who are sharing space, under sustained tension. The specific quality of 7 people, each managing their own fear in close quarters, occasionally letting it leak into a tone of voice or a too sharp response to a reasonable question, and then pulling it back and going on with the day. The hardest version of this was between Eli and me, and it's worth explaining why. Eli Cassius was the kind of person who organizes by doing, and I was the kind of person who organizes by thinking. And in a space 16 by 20 feet, those are not compatible operating styles without a negotiation that neither of us had initiated. He had rearranged the storage loft on the second day without asking, and the arrangement he'd produced was logically sound, but it destroyed my inventory mapping, and I had said so with a precision that was accurate and a tone that was not kind, and he had looked at me for a long moment and said, "I'll put it back the way it was," and done so without further comment. And the civil surface of that interaction had not touched whatever was underneath it. Sarah mediated without appearing to mediate, which I recognized as a skill and noted without knowing how to emulate it. She gave each of us a task that required the other, which forced a functional collaboration that eventually, through sheer repetition, became something closer to tolerance, and then something closer to actual coordination. On day 18, Eli and I ran the cliff-top observation together for a full 4-hour block and said almost nothing, and what little we said was useful, and by the end of it, we had developed a hand signal system for distinguishing between threat categories at road level, and that felt like a negotiation completed through means I hadn't anticipated. The infected appeared at road level for the first time that same evening. 2 of them, moving north, the characteristic gait that Sarah had described. Not stumbling, not slow, just wrong in the specific way that human locomotion is wrong when the thing operating the body has lost its understanding of why the body is moving. They didn't stop. They didn't look at the cliff. They moved through and were gone, and I stayed at the slit for 2 hours after. And Cora sat behind me in the dark with her notebook and wrote down the time, the direction, and the number, and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. June Park got sick on day 23, and for 36 hours, I was not certain she was going to be the kind of sick that stays sick. It wasn't infection. Sarah was certain of that within the first 4 hours. And Sarah's certainty on medical questions had earned a weight in this group that nobody contested. It was a respiratory infection, bacterial, the kind that June's age and compromised immune function from the chronic hip inflammation made serious in a way it would not have been for someone younger. She developed a fever of 102.4 that Sarah tracked hourly with a thermometer from her kit, and by the second night, it was 103.1. And I sat at the observation slit and did my 4-hour watch and listened to June's breathing from the sleeping area behind me and tried not to perform the statistical calculation I was performing anyway. The antibiotic question was this. We had amoxicillin in the combined medical kit, a partial course of 14 days that Sarah had used a week of on a previous trip for a dental infection, leaving 7 days remaining. 7 days was the threshold between effective treatment and incomplete treatment that risks resistance. June needed a full course. We had half of one. Sarah said, give her the 7 days, monitor response, and make the decision on day 7 about what comes next. What comes next was the part nobody said out loud. If the partial course arrested the infection, it was resolved. If it didn't, we were looking at a bacterial pneumonia in a 63-year-old woman 60 feet above a tidal channel, 14 miles from any hospital that no longer existed. I gave Sarah the full medical inventory and told her to make the call and that whatever she decided I would support. This cost me more than I expected it to, not because I didn't trust her. I trusted her completely by that point, but because I had spent 3 years building a system in which every consequential decision was mine, and the act of deliberately transferring a consequential decision to someone else felt like a structural change I hadn't scheduled. On day 4 of the antibiotic course, June's fever dropped to 100.2. On day 6, she was sitting up and eating full portions, and had resumed her cliff-top observation shift, moving to the position she'd found herself, methodically and without complaint. And on day 7, Sarah assessed her as clear, and I let out a breath I'd been holding for 5 days with an involuntary quality that I found slightly embarrassing. June, watching me do it, said, "You thought I was going to die." "I didn't know," I said. "That's what I said." She was quiet for a moment. "You know what's interesting? I didn't think I was going to die. I was too busy being angry at how uncomfortable the sleeping arrangement is." She looked at the second platform, the sawhorses and spare decking, and then back at me. "You should have built this place for 2, minimum." "I built it for 1, I said. "Yes," she said. "You keep saying that." There was something in her voice that was not criticism and was not sympathy, but was the particular tone of someone who has reached an age where they can say a true thing without needing to soften it or harden it. And I carried that observation for a long time before I fully understood what she was giving me. The coastal road shifted in character on day 25. The random passage of individuals and small groups that had marked the first 3 weeks gave way to something more organized, a southward movement of vehicles. Not a convoy. The spacing was too irregular for coordination, but a trending direction that Eli and I tracked from the clifftop slid over a 48-hour window. 12 vehicles, mostly trucks and SUVs, all heading south. One of them, a white Forest Service truck, was moving at a pace that suggested mechanical distress, and it pulled off the road 200 yards north of the clifftop access point, and 2 people got out and looked at the engine for 17 minutes, and then did something I hadn't seen in 3 weeks. They talked to each other in normal tones, not whispering, standing in open daylight next to a broken truck, and their voices carried faint and unintelligible on the coastal wind. When they got back in the truck and it started and they drove south, I felt something I didn't immediately categorize. It took me a few minutes to understand. It was relief at hearing ordinary human conversation at normal volume, which is not a thing you notice you are missing until the absence has been going on long enough. Marcus came up to relieve us at the end of the block and asked what we'd seen. Eli told him. Marcus looked south down the road and said, "Whatever's south of here is better than what's north." He said it as a factual observation. No inflection, no agenda. But we all held it anyway. The supply conversation happened on day 29, and it was the first time all 7 of us were in the cabin at the same time for a reason other than weather or emergency. I had the inventory spread on the table. Paper sheets, pencil columns, the kind of record-keeping that I understood as language better than spoken words. I walked through the numbers without preamble because preamble in this context would have been its own kind of cruelty, telling people that bad news was coming without telling them the bad news. The summary was, at current consumption, including the tidal harvest, we had 9 weeks of adequate nutrition remaining. After 9 weeks, we would have enough calories to maintain reduced function for an additional 3 to 4 weeks. After that, we were looking at a situation that I did not want to describe, but that everyone in that room was capable of extrapolating from the numbers I'd already given them. Tom said, "What's the trajectory of the tidal harvest? Can we increase it?" "Marcus and I have run it 3 times this week," Eli said. "We're at the ceiling for the accessible shelf. The deeper pools would require a free dive in 48-degree water, and the caloric expenditure of the dive offsets the gain." Silence. June said, "Then we need to be somewhere else in 9 weeks, or supplemented by something outside the cliff system." Sarah said, "That means leaving the cliff." Cora said, "That means leaving the cliff," Sarah confirmed. Satan. I had been sitting with this for 6 days before I brought it to the group, running the alternative calculations, looking for a version of the numbers that held. There wasn't one. The cliff was safe. The cliff was also finite. Those 2 facts were in direct contradiction with each other, and resolving the contradiction required accepting that the thing I had built as a permanent solution was actually a temporary one, and the timeline on the temporary was 9 weeks. What I did not expect was how quickly the group accepted this. Cora had already been running signal analysis toward the military band broadcast. It was originating, she now believed, from somewhere between Brookings and Crescent City, a 50-mile corridor of coastline to the south that corresponded exactly with the direction the vehicle movement on the coastal road had been trending. Whatever was there, something had held. Something was still broadcasting with enough power and consistency to suggest it was operating from a stable source, rather than a generator running on borrowed time. Sarah said, "If we're moving, we should be moving in a direction that's already drawing traffic." "Traffic draws infected," I said. "Traffic also draws people who might have medicine, food, and tools we don't," she replied, with the specific patience of someone who had already thought through my objection. I looked around the table. 7 people who had not, individually, been my choices, who had arrived at my cliff through combinations of circumstance and capability and need that I would never have selected for in advance, who had reorganized my storage loft and eaten my supplies and slept on my floor and watched my observations slit and brought me coffee in the morning, even though I had never once asked for it. I said, "We have 9 weeks to plan it correctly." Eli said 8. "We should move before we're depleted." He was right. I knew he was right. I said so. That was the first time I said to Eli Cassius, out loud and directly, "You're right." He didn't make anything of it. He just nodded and picked up the road map and said, "Show me where the broadcast corridor is." We spent a week on the plan, the way I'd learned to do everything in the cabin. Collectively, iteratively, with each person's knowledge domain contributing something the others couldn't replicate. Tom knew coastal access points and tidal windows. Sarah knew medical contingencies and physical assessment. She evaluated each of us for load capacity, injury vulnerability, and pace tolerance, and her assessments were precise and delivered without hierarchy. June's hip and Cora's knee treated as logistical variables rather than deficiencies. Marcus knew the water. Eli knew tools and mechanical systems and had a working knowledge of fuel ranges and engine diagnostics from the brush clearing work he'd done across a dozen different properties. Cora mapped the signal geography against the road network. June, who had spent 30 years as an extension agent working with rural communities across 3 counties, had a knowledge of back roads, property access points, and rural infrastructure that proved more valuable than anything on a printed map. I contributed the inventory, the math, and something I hadn't fully named to myself until Cora named it for me one evening when we were sitting on the observation platform after the group had gone inside. "You think in contingencies," she said. "Everyone else is thinking about the primary route. You're already living in the scenarios where it fails. That's anxiety," I said. "Sometimes," she said. "In this case, it's the thing keeping everyone else from having to carry it alone." I thought about that. I thought about what it meant that I had spent 3 years designing a system to carry everything alone, and that the system was now working better than I had designed it, because I was no longer carrying everything alone. The plan had 4 legs. First leg, cliff top to Cora's house, under cover of pre-dawn dark, to collect the root cellar contents and fold them into our carry load. Second leg, Cora's house to a county service road that June had identified from memory, running parallel to the coast highway and used primarily for access to utility infrastructure. Third leg, county service road to a fishing camp Tom had worked out of 2 summers prior, 14 miles south, with a structure he assessed as defensible and a location with known freshwater access. Fourth leg, fishing camp to the broadcast corridor. Timing and route depended on what we learned at the fishing camp. The planning took 7 days. The loading took 2. On the morning of departure, day 38 of the cabin occupation, I stood on the observation platform for the last time and looked at the tidal channel and the tooth standing in the gray early water, and I felt something I wasn't prepared for. Not grief exactly. Something quieter than grief and more permanent. The specific recognition that the version of yourself who built a thing is not the same version standing in it after it has held you through 38 days of the world ending, and that the distance between those 2 versions is made of everything you couldn't have planned for. Sarah came out and stood beside me. "You built something that worked," she said. "I built something that became something else," I said. "That's the same thing," she said. "If it can become something else, it worked." I latched the panel behind us when we left. I don't know why. The cabin wasn't going anywhere, and nobody was coming for it. But it felt like an act of respect for the thing as it had been, and I've never been sorry I did it. The pre-dawn crossing to Cora's house took 11 minutes, and produced the kind of concentrated fear that I have since learned to distinguish from the ambient fear that becomes background noise after a few weeks of sustained threat. Ambient fear is constant and manageable. Acute fear is brief and completely consuming. We crossed 30 yards of coastal scrub and a back gate and a kitchen door in 11 minutes. And the whole time, I was registering sound with a specificity that I have never since achieved in any other context. The root cellar produced more than Cora had estimated. She had canned 32 jars of vegetables, 8 of fish, 12 of various preserved fruits, and stored 14 pounds of dried beans and 20 of flour in sealed buckets against the back wall. June assessed the total with the quick efficiency of someone who had spent decades calculating yield, and revised our resource timeline upward by 3 weeks on the move. We were in the house for 42 minutes. Tom and Eli distributed the root cellar contents into packs with a speed that I recognized as practiced. They had worked harvest loads before, knew instinctively how to balance weight against pace across different body types. Marcus took the heaviest single pack without discussion. We left through the back gate at 4:17 a.m. The coastal road was empty in both directions. June took point on the county service road, which was invisible from the highway behind a slope of coastal scrub and a drainage channel that ran parallel for 3 miles before bending inland. She moved at a pace that surprised me, the hip working through its limitations with the same methodical stubbornness she brought to everything, and Tom stayed at her shoulder without crowding her. The first contact came at mile 2. A single figure, male, in the service road's drainage channel. moving in the trending pattern Sarah had described. Not toward us. He hadn't registered us. But along the channel, in the same directional bias we'd been watching from the cliff, toward density, toward the signatures of gathered human presence. He was 40 yards east and moving away. We stopped. Complete stillness. 7 people, for 90 seconds, that felt architecturally distinct from all other 90 seconds I've experienced. He moved on without turning. We moved on 30 seconds after he disappeared around the drainage bend. Nobody spoke for the next 40 minutes. We didn't need to. The hand signals Eli and I had developed on the clifftop had been taught to the group over the preceding week, and they functioned in the dark with a clarity that, in a different context, I might have found elegant. The fishing camp was there. Tom had assessed it accurately. A single-story structure, cinder block foundation, corrugated metal roof, 2 rooms, a storage shed with a roof-fed water tank still holding 40%. Eli checked the structure while the rest of us held the perimeter in the pre-dawn gray, and came back and said, "Clear. The door lock is broken, but the windows are intact, and the shed has a bar latch on the inside." We were inside by 5:40 a.m. June sat down immediately and assessed her hip with the focused, private attention of someone who has been managing pain long enough to treat it as information rather than complaint. Sarah crouched beside her without being asked. The broadcast was stronger here. Cora had the hand radio out before the packs were set down, and the military band channel was clear enough to make out words. What the words said changed every calculation we had made. The broadcast identified itself as a FEMA coordination station at Crescent City, California, 40 miles south, not a field unit. A permanent facility, the message said, with medical capacity, water filtration, food distribution, and a security perimeter that had been operational for 3 weeks. It broadcast a set of arrival protocols. Approach via Highway 101 between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. Identify with hands raised. Wait for escort. It repeated this on an 8-minute loop. It also said something that I've thought about every day since. We are at 60% of capacity. We can receive more. 60% of capacity. Not full, not closed. Still receiving. Sarah looked at me. I looked at Cora. The calculation that moved through that room was visible on every face. Not because we were all making the same calculation, but because we were all making different calculations, and the result was the same. Tom said, 40 miles on foot is 4 days minimum. 3 days if the road is clear enough to move during daylight, Eli said. The road won't be clear, Marcus said. But it'll be passable if we move smart. June said, I can do 3 days. She said it the way she said everything, as information, not argument. It settled immediately. The fishing camp held us for 2 days while we rested, inventoried, and watched the road through the structure's narrow windows. The vehicle movement we'd been observing from the cliff continued to southward. On the second day, a group of 11 passed on the highway. On foot, organized, moving with the specific pace of people who had a destination and believed they would reach it. They had a hand-painted sign on a cart they were pulling. Cora read it from the window. Crescent City. Underneath that, in different handwriting, 3 days. We left at dawn on day 3. The road leg was the part of the story that I have the hardest time compressing because what happened on it happened over 70 miles of hours, and I don't want to reduce it to a list of incidents. What I'll say is this. We moved in a formation Sarah had designed with medical contingency logic. The most mobile people at the front and rear, the people with movement limitations in the middle with clear egress options to the roadside cover, the packs distributed to balance pace against endurance rather than just weight. It worked better than I expected, which I say without any pride because the credit belongs entirely to Sarah's design. We had 3 encounters. The first was a cluster of infected in a rest stop parking lot that we identified from 400 yards and routed around via a Forest Service road Tom knew. The second was a family of 5. 2 parents, 3 children under 12, sheltering in a highway maintenance shed. who joined us after a conversation that took 9 minutes and required no persuasion beyond Cora describing the broadcast in terms that were precise and neither hopeful nor frightening. The third was a truck, Forest Service white, broken down on the highway shoulder that I recognized from the clifftop observation 20 days earlier. Inside the truck was a single woman, 40 years old, who had been surviving in the vehicle since the breakdown, eating from what remained in the cab and watching the road. Her name was Alicia Torres, and she was a hydrologist who had been doing coastal survey work when the world changed. And she had stayed with the broken truck because she had nowhere else to go, and had not yet identified what going toward would mean. She looked at our group, now 12, with the family added, and then at me, because I'd been the first one to the truck window. "Where are you going?" she asked. "South," I said. "There's a facility at Crescent City." She looked at the road ahead, then back at me. "I can walk," she said. "Then come." And I said it without calculation, which was new. We reached the outskirts of Crescent City on the afternoon of the third road day. And I want to tell you what it looked like from the highway approach, because it didn't look like what I'd been imagining. I had been imagining the kind of facility that broadcasts on a military band channel. Structured, defensive, geometric, institutional. What I saw was a town that had been organized from within rather than imposed from outside. The security perimeter was vehicles, trucks and buses arranged in overlapping arcs with clear fields of view, staffed by people in civilian clothes with laminated FEMA vests over whatever they'd been wearing when they arrived. Inside the perimeter, which was porous in a way that a military setup would never have been, was a neighborhood that had been converted to its present purpose through the specific creative improvisation of people working without a manual. A woman with a clipboard met us at the designated arrival point. She looked at our group of 13. We had picked up one more family on the road's final day, a couple with a teenager who had been moving south for a week. And she did not appear surprised by the number. She appeared, specifically, to be doing the same mental inventory I had been doing for the past 5 weeks, looking at the group not as bodies to manage, but as people with skills to integrate. "Names and useful backgrounds," she said, "as quickly as you can." Sarah spoke first. "Wilderness EMT, 7 years." She was through the entrance before she finished the sentence, directed by a second person who was clearly waiting for exactly that. Tom. "Marine environment and tidal systems, commercial fishing experience, flagged, redirected." Marcus. "Same, with boat mechanical." Flagged, same direction. June. "County extension, 30 years, rural infrastructure and agricultural systems." The clipboard woman looked up from her sheet. "We've been waiting for you for a week," she said, which was not literally true, but was the kind of thing you say when a person's skills match a gap so precisely that relief supersedes precision. Eli. "Structural assessment, mechanical systems." Gone. Alicia. "Hydrology, coastal survey." Another look over the clipboard, another redirect. Cora. "High school math, signals analysis." She held up her notebook. The clipboard woman took it, looked at the first 3 pages, and said, "Come with me specifically." I was last. "And you," the clipboard woman said. "I built a supply system for 14 months that kept 7 people fed for 5 weeks," I said. "I kept records. I know what we used and when and in what proportions. And I know what the margin of error looks like when you're managing resources for groups whose size changes faster than you can plan for." She wrote something on her clipboard. "We have 240 people in here and 3 weeks of planned supply. Our logistics coordinator broke her wrist yesterday." She looked at me. "Come with me too." I had $17 in a checking account. I had a cabin on a cliff that I had built for one, and that had held 7 people eyeing through 38 days of the world changing around it. I had a notebook of inventory records that were accurate to the day, and a set of skills that had been built to support isolation, and it ended up being most useful in the exact opposite context. I followed her through the perimeter. The supply situation at Crescent City was better than 3 weeks and worse than it looked. which is almost always how it is when you audit a system that's been managed by people under active stress rather than stable conditions. The numbers had been tracked, but the tracking had not accounted for intake variability, boilage differentials across storage locations, the caloric differential between sedentary and active population segments, or the simple fact that the people doing the counting had been doing 8 other things simultaneously, and had sometimes estimated rather than measured. I'm not telling this to diminish what they had built. What they had built was extraordinary. I'm telling it because the gap between what the numbers said and what the numbers meant was the first problem I could solve, and solving it correctly meant that the facility's actual timeline was extended by 2 weeks, not because we found more food, but because we stopped wasting what we had through misallocation. The logistics coordinator was named Brent Nakamura, 45 years old, a supply chain manager from a food distribution company in Reading, who had driven north with his family and ended up running the facility's material flow from a folding table in what had been a middle school classroom. His wrist was in a proper splint. Sarah had done that on her second day. And he was working one-handed with the specific focused frustration of someone who cannot bear to stop working because stopping means thinking about everything else. He looked at my records from the cabin and said nothing for 4 minutes. Then he said, "You used percentage of baseline tracking instead of absolute count. It's more informative under variable population conditions," I said. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to switch to it for 2 weeks and couldn't find the time." He looked at me. "Can you set up a full system by tomorrow morning?" "By tonight," I said. That evening, I sat in the middle school classroom and built a tracking structure for 241 people. We'd had 2 arrivals that afternoon, a pair of brothers from a coastal ranch 20 miles north, and when I finished and looked at what I'd built, it looked almost exactly like what I had built for 7 people in a 16 by 20 cabin on a cliff face, scaled by a factor of 34. The shape of the problem was the same. The tools for addressing it were the same. The only thing that had changed was the number in the denominator, and the number in the denominator was the reason the problem mattered. I found Cora the next morning in the room they'd given her for signal work, which was a corner of the same building with 2 additional hand-crank radios and a power inverter someone had brought in. She had already produced, in one night, a map of active broadcast sources across a 300-mile radius that was the most coherent picture of surviving organized settlements I had yet seen. "There are 6 of them," she said, "including this one, possibly 7. There's a signal from the Willamette Valley I can't fully resolve. 6 stable settlements within 300 miles, 60% of capacity at this one." I thought about what it would mean to know what the capacity of the other 5 was, and what the distance between them implied about supply corridor possibilities, and what Alicia's hydrology training would mean for water security assessment across a connected network of settlements rather than a single site. June was already in a meeting with the facility's agricultural committee, which had been an idea for 3 weeks and became a functioning body the day she arrived. Tom and Marcus had been integrated into a water access team that was mapping the local river system for supplementary harvest points. Eli had assessed 3 structures in the perimeter for load-bearing reinforcement. Sarah was in the medical area, which I'd not yet visited. And when I walked through it that evening to check on the family we'd found in the maintenance shed, 2 of their 3 children had chest colds. She was standing at a table doing an inventory of pharmaceutical supplies with the same systematic precision she'd applied to our combined kit on the cliff. She looked up. "You look like you slept." 4 hours, I said. "Better than I expected, because you had something to do," she said. "Because the work made sense," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "That's the same thing," she said. She had said that to me before, with different words, on the cliff platform the morning we left. The shape of the thing she was saying was consistent. I thought I understood it this time. 3 weeks after our arrival, Brent Nakamura walked into the middle school classroom at 7 in the morning and set a printed map on the table in front of me. Printed because they had a working printer, which had felt like an extraordinary luxury the first time I saw it and felt ordinary now. The map showed the 6 confirmed settlements Cora had identified, with estimated population figures next to each. Crescent City, 241. A settlement in Medford that turned out to be organized around a hospital that had never fallen, 180. A community in the Willamette Valley built around an agricultural processing facility, estimated 400, but still resolving. 3 smaller coastal nodes, 30 to 80 people each, all in the same broadcast corridor Cora had been tracking from the first week in the cabin. We're not 6 separate problems, Brent said. We're one problem distributed across 6 locations, and we don't have anyone thinking about it at that scale yet. I looked at the map for a long time. What are you asking? I said. I'm not sure yet, he said. I'm asking whether you can see it. I could see it. That was the honest answer, and I gave it. Yes. What I could see was this: a supply chain problem of the same fundamental architecture as what I had been managing, but with the distance variable introduced. The same percentage of baseline tracking, applied not to one location, but to a network. The same differential between what the numbers said and what they meant, multiplied by the variability of 6 independent tracking systems that had never been designed to speak to each other. The same fundamental question of allocation under scarcity, now with the additional variable of distribution across geography, rather than a single floor plan. I thought about the cabin. I thought about the moment I had sat at the table and walked 7 people through the food timeline math, and had felt the weight of what I was carrying and the simultaneous, unexpected relief of no longer carrying it alone. I thought about how the system had worked better because Eli reorganized the loft, and Tom identified the tidal harvest, and Sarah designed the travel formation, and Cora mapped the signal geography, and how none of that would have happened if I had been alone on that cliff with my 14 months of supplies and my 41 paperbacks and my closed system. I'll need the inventory structures from all 6 sites, I said. Current and historical if they kept records. And I'll need Cora. You can have Cora if she's willing, Brent said. Ask her, I said. She'll say yes. He looked at me with a slight smile. You sound like you know her well. She's been watching me make mistakes and correcting my blind spots since before the outbreak, I said. I'd call that well. He left, and I turned back to the table and looked at the map. 6 points, connected by roads that may or may not be passable, by broadcast channels that Cora was already threading into a coherent signal picture, by the specific shared fact of having survived long enough to still need food and water and medicine, and the kind of record-keeping that converts survival into something more sustainable than luck. I picked up a pencil. I drew a line between Crescent City and Medford, then Medford and the Willamette Valley. The shape that emerged on the map was not geometric. It followed the geography of what it held, not the geometry of what had been planned. But it was a shape. It was a system. I started with the numbers I had, the way I always did, and I followed where they led, the way I was learning to. I kept the notebook from the cabin. The spiral-bound one Cora started on the first night she was with us, with the frequency maps and the silence geography and the careful, even columns of things observed and timed and recorded without editorial. Just data, just the honest accounting of what was there. I have since filled 11 more notebooks. They are stored in a room in the middle school building that we call the records office now, which is a grand name for a converted classroom with steel shelving and a rotating roster of people who understand why the numbers matter. Brent runs the network logistics from a proper desk. Cora's signal team has resolved the Willamette Valley contact and identified 2 additional nodes we missed in the first survey. June is growing things, literally. She has a 12-person agricultural committee and a soil amendment program running across 3 sites. Marcus calls from the coastal survey team on a schedule. The tidal channel at the cabin still runs. I know because he's mapped it twice. I was alone for 3 years building something that worked. I was not alone for a single day of the time it actually mattered. And the record I kept of those days is the most accurate thing I've ever produced, because the subject matter finally deserved the precision. The denominator keeps growing. I keep counting. That's enough.